Three, two, one, liftoff. Billionaires are literally launching rockets into the sky right now, and they all share one massive, incredibly ambitious goal: putting your internet in space. Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to unpack the reality behind the great internet space race. We've got Jeff Bezos with Project Kuiper, Elon Musk with Starlink, and Richard Branson backing OneWeb. It is a modern-day gold rush, but instead of mining the Earth, they are aiming for the stars. So let's dive right into this, because to truly understand why these billionaires are looking up, we first need to look down. Now, I want you to stop for a second and just ask yourself, where exactly is the internet right now? I mean, if you had to point to it, where would you point? It's a really fundamental question, but it tees up a massive misconception we have about how our data actually travels every single time we stream a video, send a text, or load a web page. It's a funny question, right? But our global infrastructure is actually wildly misunderstood. Someone was once asked to literally draw the internet, and they famously responded, "I thought of the internet as a bunch of cats." And honestly, fair enough. Think about the everyday language we use. We talk about saving things to the cloud, or we upload a file, or download a picture. It completely tricks us into thinking that our data just lives magically up in the sky somewhere. But the physical reality is far more grounded. Get this. Up to 99% of international internet traffic actually travels underwater. No way, right? But it's true. To put that into perspective, recent estimates show there are roughly 436 active cables, made up of over 800,000 miles of wire, literally crisscrossing the bottom of our oceans. So for the vast majority of us, your internet isn't in space at all. It's sitting right there on the dark ocean floor. Let's move on to Section 1, Decoding the Deep. This is all about how the physical internet works. So the process here is beautifully simple, but physically it's incredibly complex. These deep-sea cables carry information as actual flashes of visible light. Imagine taking a flashlight and turning it on and off in code, pointing it down a massive tube that stretches across the entire ocean. Only you're doing it millions of times faster down a tiny glass fiber. And getting these cables down there, it's a monumental task. Specialized ships load up these massive spools and just slowly creep across the ocean at about 7 miles per hour. It takes weeks, weaving a literal web around the world. And they don't build bridges over deep ocean trenches either. They just spool out enough cable so it falls all the way down to the bottom. Now, to really grasp how this physical setup dictates your daily scrolling, you have to think of bandwidth like the width of a water pipe. It measures exactly how much data can flow through in a set period of time, which we usually measure in megabits per second. A 400 megabit connection essentially means hundreds of millions of data points are rushing through that pipe every single second. And right alongside that, we have latency. So if bandwidth is the width of the pipe, latency is the length of that pipe. It measures the physical time it takes for that stream of information to travel from one end to the other, measured in milliseconds. Here is the absolutely crucial point to remember. Latency pairs with bandwidth to dictate your overall internet quality. Low bandwidth and high latency, that means terrible, constantly buffering internet. High bandwidth and low latency, that gives you incredibly fast, seamless internet. It is the absolute core metric for evaluating any new communication technology. So when we compare these underwater fiber optic cables to traditional, older satellites, it's an absolute blowout. Fiber uses visible light, giving us very low latency, and it's actually relatively cheap to maintain once it's laid down. Old satellites, on the other hand, like HughesNet or Viasat, sit way up high in space. They have to convert data into radio waves, which then have to travel a massive, massive distance up into space and all the way back down. That creates super high latency and makes the service quite expensive. So for decades, fiber has been the undisputed champion of connectivity. Which brings us to Section 2, the digital divide, and exactly why fiber just isn't enough. Here's the real kicker, and the biggest reason these billionaires are racing to space right now. Our underwater infrastructure is awesome, for sure, but it simply isn't reaching everyone. In the US, the Federal Communications Commission estimates that about 14 million Americans lack access to fast internet. But Microsoft, they estimate that number is actually over 120 million. So why such a massive gap? Well, it mostly comes down to flawed data collection. The FCC relies heavily on self-reported data from internet service providers. Basically, if a provider gives high-speed internet to just one single person in a massive census block, they get to check a box and count the entire block as connected. This dramatically hides the true scale of rural and underserved communities that lack basic access. And when we zoom out from the US, the global scale of this problem is absolutely staggering. We're talking about roughly 4 billion people worldwide who are completely locked out of the modern digital economy. Laying fiber cables is super expensive. In a dense city with thousands of paying customers, sure, it makes financial sense. But out in rural or geographically challenging areas, companies simply won't lay the cable because they know they won't make their money back. And that, right there, is what creates the digital divide. This leads us right into Section 3, the Great Space Race, focusing on low Earth orbit constellations. You know, the idea of communicating through space isn't actually a brand new concept. I mean, Telstar 1, the very first communication satellite, launched way back in 1962. It had, let's say, mixed results. Fast forward a bit to 2020, and OneWeb was rescued from bankruptcy to focus heavily on business connectivity. And jumping to the present day, we've got Starlink actively expanding everywhere. What's revolutionary here isn't the basic idea of space internet itself, it's the wildly modern execution of it. What they are doing here builds a completely new paradigm. See, older geosynchronous satellites sit way up high in orbit. Because they are so high up, you really only need a few of them to cover the globe. But that massive distance creates that terrible high latency we talked about earlier. The new projects, though, like Starlink and Project Cooper, they use low Earth orbit. By lowering the altitude significantly, you drastically reduce the latency. The data just doesn't have to travel nearly as far. But what's the trade-off? Well, because they are so close to the Earth, their field of view is much smaller. That means you need thousands of these moving satellites all functioning together as a giant constellation just to cover the globe. But here's the crazy part. For the actual user, the setup is shockingly simple. I mean, compare it to the massive, months-long endeavor of spooling thousands of miles of glass cable off the back of a ship. Getting connected to a system like Starlink is literally a two-step process. Step 1, point the dish at the sky. Step 2, plug it into the wall. It's essentially magic space Wi-Fi delivered right to your backyard, boasting surprisingly high bandwidth and low latency for a satellite system. All right, Section 4, the cost of space connectivity and the complications of thousands of satellites. Because as you might guess, there are some serious earthly limitations to this tech. You need a clear line of sight to these fast-moving satellites, so something as simple as a tall tree in your yard can actually interrupt the signal. But the real complications go way beyond your landscaping. Listen to what astronomers are warning us about. They say that sending tens of thousands of these highly reflective satellites into low Earth orbit creates an immense amount of light pollution. And ground-based astronomy is absolutely crucial to answering some of the most fundamental questions about our universe. But even more practically than that, ground-based telescopes are exactly how we manage planetary defense against asteroids. If the night sky becomes absolutely flooded with artificial, moving lights, these vital scientific and defensive observations become incredibly difficult, if not completely impossible. Which brings us to Section 5, connecting the remaining 4 billion. It's all about turning a luxury into a commodity. How do we weigh these costs against the benefits? Because we have to look at both sides here. The impacts of true global connectivity are undeniably world-changing. Seriously, when fast internet arrives in an underserved area, the transformation is immediate. Job growth follows, new businesses form, unemployment drops, people suddenly gain access to telemedicine, which leads to far better health outcomes, and entirely new avenues of education open up. Plus, it creates remarkable crisis resilience. When terrestrial infrastructure on the ground is destroyed by war or natural disasters, space-based internet can step in immediately, like we saw firsthand with Starlink being rapidly activated in Ukraine during the conflict. The ultimate goal here is to make high-speed internet cheaper, better, and globally available, elevating 4 billion people straight into the digital age. So, after unpacking all of this, I want to leave you with one final thought to ponder. Can we actually connect the world without losing our view of the stars? Our existing physical internet, all those cables resting at the bottom of the sea, it's an absolute monument to human creativity and our deep desire to connect. But clearly the job isn't finished. We are now facing a massive technological balancing act, empowering the remaining half of humanity with the knowledge and economy of the internet, while simultaneously preserving the pristine night sky that has inspired human curiosity since the beginning of time. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking questions, and I'll see you next time.